Good afternoon, everyone. This is my tester sample tutorial of a petal with water droplets. I have painted one already and I'm just going to show you the image that I used to paint this from. So I'm going to now draw another drawing with my pencil, just doing the outline and also drawing in the water droplets. I'm using my putty rubber to dab out most of the graphite so it doesn't show through the painting, but I can just about see my drawing. I'm going to use permanent rose, alizarin crimson and a little bit of green to darken my deep pinks to get that shadow effect so it looks concave and it gives you the shape. So I'm going to wet everything, the whole petal, but I'm not going to wet the water droplets. Using size 10 brush, round brush, very carefully with clean water, I'm going to wet everything in the petal around the water droplets, making sure not to get any water in the droplets. Looking at the paper to see how shiny it is, I can see how wet the paper is. If it has a sheen, it's probably not wet enough, so you want to wet it, look at it to see it. You want a nice gloss, so you get it really wet, because we're going to add layers and layers of colour and we want it all to stay nice and soft. So just wet it, keep on looking at it, keep on moving your paintbrush, wet it and wet it again. Just went over the line a little bit, so I'm just going to dry it with a clean tissue. Now I'm looking at it thinking, right, it's getting a sheen, so I need to wet it to get that nice gloss, so it's evenly wet. So the paper is saturated evenly, I should say. So here I'm looking to see the sheen. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's good to look at the paper to see how glossy it is, then you can tell how wet. If it starts puddling, just get your thirsty brush and touch that puddle, because you don't want puddles, so that you'll end up with a cauliflower. Just want it evenly distributed. See, I'm taking my time over this so it stays nice and wet for a long time. Now I'm mixing my colours, a bit of permanent rose. If you don't have permanent rose, you can just use alizarin crimson, watered down, that will give you a nice pinky colour. I'm using alizarin crimson also for a darker, deeper red. So I'm making another puddle there. Getting more pigment so it's nice and dark and quite thick. Then I'm using a bit of green, so you can use sap green, olive green, any of the greens that you might have. That will darken. That is the opposite colour of the colour wheel in reds, so it will, just using a little bit will darken that deep red. So going in with a permanent rose, I'm just going to give it a layer, taking care not to paint my water droplets. I'm going to switch now to a bigger brush because it's quite a big area I need to fill in. Just use my finger to remove some paint which I went over the line. Taking my time over this, you can see it's all still very wet and shiny, so it'll stay nice and soft, the colours. You can layer darker colours on top of wet if you want it to have soft edges. And you can go layering as long as it's all evenly wet still. So sometimes you have to work quite fast. But you also want to, I'm here pointing out to darkening the edges to give it that curved look. So the petal just curves around a little bit on the edges. So now I'm adding a bit of alizarin crimson. Adding a few more darker tones as I go along. Just keep on adding, and it's still nice and wet because we did wet it really well beforehand. Sometimes I dab off, I feel there's too much paint, too much watery paint on the brush, so I dab it on the tissue so I can spread it out a little bit further without putting too much paint. My light's coming from the left, so I'm going to place a little bit of shadow on the right of the water droplets. I feel there's too much paint on my brush, and it's spread out too much, so I'm just dabbing, drying my brush a little bit so I can lift a little bit of that dark paint that I've placed. Now I'm mixing up a richer colour with my alizarin crimson and the green to make it darker, so I can deepen that shadow of the petal to give it that more concave shape. I've put too much paint there, so I've got a clean, thirsty brush so I can just lift it off easily. Adding a bit more deeper tones. And going around the edges so it shows the petal is folding downwards. Now I'm softening the edge of that line I put there because it started to dry a little bit and I want it to be nice and soft. So I'm softening just on the edge of the line. So you can see how dark it is. Just on the edges as well, so I'm going to deepen with darker colour, mixing a little bit more green with my alizarin crimson and permanent rose. And you might think, oh, that's too dark, but it'll dry lighter. So when it looks too dark while it's wet, you know it'll be just right when it's dry. Now I'm adding the shadow, which again is still wet, the whole petal, so it'll give me a nice soft finish. Deepening the shadow tones. I still feel it needs a little bit more dark around the edges to indicate that the petal is bending downwards. But it has dried a lot here, so I'm adding a little bit of water just to soften that edge. adding a little bit more colour in the centre of the petal and still darkening where I feel it needs a little bit more tonal value. Felt the paint had spread a bit too much here, so again with a clean, thirsty brush, just wipe off the amount that is spread too far. Again, I feel it needs a little bit more lifting just on the edge to make it lighter. But again, darkening just on the tip of the petal where it folds over. I'm adding a little bit of yellow to the white end of the tip of the petal while it's still wet, so it blends in softly. Just gone over the edge there, so I need to now mop it up with a tissue. You can move the paint around while it's still wet, as long as you don't have a brush loaded with water. Now I'm just getting my flat brush, so it's a small flat brush, just to tidy up some of the edges. So scrub it and then lift it with a tissue, and that will neaten any edge, any lines that you might have gone out of the line. So the petal is now nice and dry, and I'm wetting the water droplets. I'm going to wet the water droplet, but just leaving the highlight. If that highlight is wet, then you'll lose it very easily. So you can either mask it with using masking fluid, or you can draw it in so that makes it easier for you to see where you should not put water. Adding a little bit of permanent rose, but I want to keep the side opposite where the little light reflection is really pale. The light does refract in that water droplet, making it paler than the palest part of the petal, if that makes sense. And then around the highlight is where I want to put a very dark, darker than any of the darkest part of the petal. And already you can see how it starts to look like a water droplet. And because it's all wet, but it's not too wet, this is where it takes practice. And you'll have more control using a small brush, so you have more control of how far the paint will flow. So I'm adding a much darker tone right around the edge, around the highlight, and lifting right at the other end, so it's really light. I keep on cleaning my brush. Every time I lift a bit of paint, I touch my tissue so it dries and cleans my brush, so I can lift more without putting any paint back on. And I'm darkening just a tiny bit around the highlight. I feel it needs a little bit darkening around the edges to give that curved look still. But because it's dry, I will wet my brush with clean water and just soften the edge. I feel I need to add a little bit more paint around the edges at the top of the petal. So I'm wetting that area because it had dried already. So when I put some paint, it just flows softly. I'm always looking at my reference picture to make sure I'm adding the tonal values where they should be. I often look at the dark and light as shapes. It makes it easier for you to determine where you should put the dark and the light areas. Again, I'm just darkening a little bit the shadow of the water droplet. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I would love to have any feedback you might have for me. Remember, this is a tester, it's a free video. Please enjoy and be safe. Take care. Bye bye.